Hello and good morning from Frankfurt. Dear guests from 5 countries and regions, welcome to our 42nd Food for Thought event in cooperation with the Association of Foreign Banks in Germany. A big thanks to our partner. Today, Frankfurt is again 1 hour ahead of London. Let's make the best of it. Market sentiment can often shape a country's economic strategy. It reflects the attitude of investors towards the market and will be revealed through price movements of securities traded. So changes in market sentiment have always been an interesting issue for researchers. Allianz decided to interview 1,000 market participants in Germany, France, and Italy to find out their views as well as their expectations. They reveal the thinking on the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, and the overall economic situation in Europe. Before kicking off Arne Holzhausen's presentation, let me remind you of 3 questions. First, in times of crisis, the EU moved most. Will the Ukraine crisis have the same effect on energy transition? Second, are there still national topics and views, or do we see a more common view appear? And third, the war has proved that the will of the EU citizens to defend democratic values. Will this influence the choice of trading partners in the future? Dr. Holzhausen will give us the answers. Arne is a head of economic research for the insurance, wealth, and ESG team at Allianz in Munich. He is responsible for analyzing and forecasting global insurance and pension markets, monitoring worldwide private assets and liabilities, and assessing the impact of ESG issues on economic and capital market outcomes. He regularly writes on economic trends impacting insurance, including low yields, regulation, technology, and demographics. Before joining Allianz in 2009, Arne has spent almost 8 years with Dresdner Bank's economic research. From 1995 to 2000, he was assistant professor at the Center for East Asian Studies of the Free University of Berlin. Arne holds a doctorate in Japanese studies and a diploma in economics. Dear audience, please feel free to input your questions during or after the speech in the Q&A section in Zoom. The PPT slides and the video recording of today's speech will be published on the FMF website tomorrow. So far for the beginning, Arne, welcome here at Food for Thought. The stage is yours.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you, Andreas, for your kind words of introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me here. It's a great honor to be guest of this Food for Thought series. And you posed 3 questions. Well, I'm not sure if I really can give the answers during our talk, but I guess together with your questions and with the discussions following my presentation, maybe we will be able at least to shed some additional lights on these very important and challenging questions. Before we start, just a few words on our survey. As Andreas said, we conduct every year a survey of a representative sample of households in France, Italy, and Germany. And the idea behind that is, well, I mean, we are here at Allianz Research macro researchers. It means we look at the aggregates, we look at the GDP, inflation, interest rate, all this interesting stuff. But we often lack the perspective of the people. What think the people? What ticks? How the people think? What are the impacts and influences that shapes the individual behavior, because in the end the economy is the sum of all the individual decisions taken by households. So it's, for us, it's very important to have this kind of micro foundation to our research. I mean, you often say you should not miss the forest for the trees, but sometimes also important to have the other view, to look at the trees to better understand really what's going on and what shapes our environment. So without further ado, let's get started. Maybe the first slide we prepared. This is the next slide, please. And here we can see this is our standard questions about what do you think about the economic situation. And the results are not surprising. I mean, this survey was conducted in May 2002, May this year, 2022. And for sure, it was 3 months after the invasion of Ukraine. So it was clear that the mood will be sober, miserable, that there was a bleak outlook. What's interesting here is that even for the Germans, normally the Germans are more optimistic. You can see that before the pandemic, they assessed the economic situation quite favorable. Then it turned negative during the pandemic, but even in 2021 already, we have seen that most Germans were at least looking into the future with more optimistic attitudes. This has changed. This has changed in this year, and we can see, and what's even more interesting is that now for the first time we conduct our survey, you can also see that the outlook is even bleaker, is even more miserable than the assessment of the current situation. Normally we have this the other way around, that people say, well, right now it's quite challenging, it's a difficult situation, but next year or the year after next year will be better. 2022, it's different. 2022, most people expect that even the next year and the near future will be even more challenging, even more difficult than the situation right now. And this is, in a way, it's understandable, because the situation with the Ukraine war is that it's difficult to see how this could all end, how this could be the exit from the situation is hard to imagine. I mean, remember the pandemic, there was at least a clear game plan, so to say. We knew that for the first phase, we have to restrict social contact, we have to quarantine, we have to isolate, then we have very quickly to develop a vaccine, and then we can start to live with the virus and with COVID-19. So at least there was kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, even if it was in 2020, very hard to see. But right now, most people are really despaired, really cannot imagine how we could exit the situation, because it's hard to see how this war should come to an peaceful end. And that is reflected also in our survey here, that most people think that the near future will be even bleaker than the current situation we are right in there. And the next slide, please, where we turn to asking what are the main concerns. And as I said, I mean, the surprising thing is that even if the war is probably behind all this misery and all this challenge we face right now, be it the inflation, be it the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, but it's not really at the top of the mind of most respondents. If you ask what is now concerned you the most, you can see this is a very typical pattern of answers we can see here. The Italians said it's all about jobs, because the Italian economy, as you know, the last 20 years was not was not really performing very well. For the last 20 years, at least in real terms, there was no increase in prosperity. There was almost no growth for the last 20 years. So always economy, jobs is the main concern of Italians. For Germany, it's more about inflation. As you have this normal saying that the Germans are really obsessed with inflation because of the history. And this is also revealed by this survey, that most Germans say the most concern, or the biggest concern for me right now, are rising prices. And for the French, it's still that as the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic is high on their minds. They say healthcare, these issues are the most pressing issues. And very surprisingly, only in Italy and Germany, this foreign policy, geopolitics, and that means the war in Ukraine, the changing geopolitics setup, this plays a role. For France respondents, for example, this is really still of no really not interest, but it's really not the most pressing issues they face right now. And this also plays into what we will see later, that many respondents are really inward looking, turning to local problems, to national problems, and really trying to ignore the wider world, the geopolitical fault lines. Then the next slide, please. Maybe ask more also directly, what's also quite interesting about what should governments do with inflation, how should they address the cost of living crisis. And what was here surprising to see, that if we ask directly, and even people or even respondents with low income, should it be not the case that governments should do some targeted subsidies? Should they not really support the vulnerable households? And then most people said, well, this is not the most effective or the best policy choice. Most people opted for general reducing taxes or price controls. That means most respondents say there should be some general measures that benefit all people. So this is quite something, because I mean, you can see that is what's happening right now, because even in Germany, but also in France, Italy, general price caps were introduced, and we have this in Germany, for example, during the summer, we had this tank or a gasoline rebate, as we called it. So there was a temporary reduction of fuel taxes, but all these measures have the big disadvantage that they cost a lot and are not targeted, and many people, all people benefit from it, and even people and even richer households that can afford to pay this higher prices. So it's a very, very broad approach, but as we can see here, it's very popular. Even people that have low income and that would be very likely the beneficiaries of these policies say, well, no, it's better to have these general measures in place so that all people improve, that all people benefit, and all people will be relieved from the rising cost pressures. And it's also that even the households with quite high income, above 5,000 euros per month, and on a net basis, the really high income people, they feel pressured by this high inflation, by these high prices, and ask for some relief. This is also something this has to be taken into account and have to be seen in the political process, because normally as economists, we always argue, even in Germany, there is the fiscal leeway, the room for maneuver is limited. We cannot afford to bail out everyone. We cannot afford to support every household. We have to be more targeted. We have really to look after the vulnerable households and give some subsidies to them. But nonetheless, for the overall population, the mood in the population is different. The mood is that everybody should be bailed out, should be supported in these times of stress, in these times of rising prices. So this is also something we found as economists quite surprising. Let's move on to the next topic, because we not only ask about the general economic situation and the immediate fallout from the war, that is the energy crisis and the high prices, but we also ask more general questions about the situation in Europe and about globalization and about the green transformation. Now we turn to the situation in Europe, and that's also quite, this is quite heartwarming, or it's quite positive outcome that we can see. For the first time, people see that this crisis might help to strengthen the unity of the European Union. Before that, for example, the pandemic, you can see in 2020, most people said, no, this will be not an event, this will be not a crisis that brings Europeans together, quite the contrary. And this was probably under the impression of the first reaction to the pandemic. We had this border closures, we have this scramble to secure supplies of masks and other medical equipment. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was really this feeling as everybody for himself and not acting together. It changed, but nonetheless, the perception and by most people whereas no, this is a crisis that brings not out unity, that is not a crisis that will foster more cooperation, quite the contrary. Now is a war. For the first time, most respondents say, no, this is something where we will act together, which will bring us together. And this, for sure, I mean, then you can argue that the pandemic is a pandemic, but a war, and especially a war at your doorsteps, is still much more challenging and much more life-threatening event that brings people together. A war is really threatening their very existence. So that means that probably it sticks together, that come people together. And this was also the first reaction. I mean, after the invasion, immediately European acted as one and have this strong unity, not only between France and Germany, but over the whole 27 members. And this was quite impressive. And I would say this was one of the only positive outcome of the whole situation, that Europe finally were able to act together as one. This is something That is a positive, but going to the next slide, you can also see that the undercurrency, the overall beliefs have hardly changed over the year. You can see here what if you ask, is the membership of the European Union beneficial, it brings more advantages or more disadvantages for a country. And again, we can see that in France, but also in Italy, more people say these are more disadvantages. And we have here the net percentages, but you can also see that, for example, where I can tell you, in France, it's only 70% of the respondents, less than 20, it's less than a fifth, that say, well, being a member of the European Union has advantages for France. Most of them say this has disadvantage. For sure, true, there's also a big share, 1/3 of the respondents that say it's balanced, disadvantage, advantage, balance each other out. So that is more a neutral view on the European Union. But it's also quite concerning or worrying to see that the support or the belief in the European project, so to speak, is so low among those respondents. It's also in Italy, it's 26%. It's a fourth of the respondents that say this has advantages. So this is really has not changed over the years. And that means that, especially in France and Italy, there's a lot of people that have reservations, have reject wholeheartedly the whole project of European unity, and have grievance against Brussels. It's a little bit different in Germany, where you have constantly seen support for the European Union, for the European project. But even in Germany, I mean, the people that say that it has an advantage to be in the European Union is 38%. So in all countries, there's not a majority that really wholeheartedly embraces the European project. There's a lot of reluctance, a lot of rejections towards the European Union. And it's even stricter if we turn to the next page, slide, where we ask about the currency. And it's constant over all the years, has not changed in the last 4 years. So pandemic, war, no matter what happens, most respondents, again, in France and Italy, are against the euro. And here, for example, if I give you another number, in Italy this year, 44% of respondents said this has more disadvantage. The euro is not good for Italy. I mean, it's almost half of the population, or half of the respondents rejected straightly, outrightly the common currency, and this after 20 years. For sure, I mean, if you look at the development in Italy, if you look at the last 20 years, as I said before, it was not great years for Italy, at least economically speaking. But on the other hand, I mean, it's Europe, and it's so easy to cross the borders, and most people spend time of their holidays in different countries, and you always use the same money, you have the same currency. And I mean, at least for German, I mean, it was the currency. You should not exaggerate too much, but I think currency, the money you use in your daily life, is part of your identity. And in Germany, it was very clear from the beginning that we were so proud to have the Deutschmark, the strong currency, the strongest currency in Europe. And there was kind of a patriotism with this money. I still remember when we had the reunification 30 years ago with the eastern part of Germany, they were claiming, give us the Deutschmarks. This was a really desire to get the strong currency as well. And in economically terms, I think the currency is then the symbol, and what makes clear that you're living in a strong and economic viable country. And this was also the idea behind the introduction of the euro, to bring Europeans together by using the same currency as a first step to form something like a European identity, a common identity. But then in the next step, you can probably also go further and have this kind of political unification, and bringing together also in other policy areas, a closer collaboration, or even a federal system. But as we have seen, now we have to admit, with the introduction of the currency, probably not in economic terms, but at least for this symbolic and political aspirations, has failed, because still after 20 years, this currency, this common currency, is rejected by most respondents in France and Italy. It's different in Germany, again, but even in Germany, the support of the common currency is rather lukewarm. We have 35% that say this is positive for Germany. The rest, 30% say it's negative, and then there's a huge number of people that are neutral or do not know. So even in Germany, where you could argue is probably the biggest beneficiary of the common currency, because it's secured our markets. It has now, we have not any longer to fight this constantly appreciation with the German market. It was a headache for our exporters. Now we have a rather, at least right now, but in general terms also a rather weaker currency that makes it life much easier for the German industry. And this is one of the reasons why we can see that German industry was so successful in the last couple of years when it comes to trade and entering and conquering foreign markets. So Germany is really doing a good job. We have benefited a great deal from this current common currency, but still it's only 1/3 of the population, 1/3 of the respondents and say so or think so. The rest is more negative or at least neutral. That means it's hard to see. I mean, we are not expecting that something like a Brexit, let's say Telexit or a Frexit is around the corner, but it makes clear that there is so much grievance against this European project as is symbolized by the common currency. And that means that it's quite easy for politicians to play this card, to position themselves as populist against Brussels, against this ruling from Europe, this overruling of national or local peculiarities. So that still, I mean, we have seen this unity and we've seen the summits and we see that Mr. Scholz and Macron meet and talk about the ground things. But on the ground, if you really ask the people, they are quite skeptical, to put it mildly, against this whole endeavor. And that means there's still a lot of potential for be it right wing, be it left wing, populists to exploit this kind of skepticism and grievance against Brussels. Let's move to the next topic. So it's also not very heartwarming. We're talking about globalization or deglobalization, to be more precise. And again, what we can see here is it's a more nuanced picture, but we see again that Germans are, surprise, surprise, really behind globalization. Most respondents think that it's a good thing, that Germany benefited from this whole process over the last, let's say, 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's for sure. I mean, would be surprised if Germans said, no, we are as victims of globalization. That's true, but it's the case in France. And frankly speaking, yes, Germany has probably a bigger industry, has a higher share of manufacturing jobs, but all in all, the differences in the economic structure, the structure of the economy, the differences in the embeddment into the global value chain is not so big between France and Germany. France has also a big car industry. France has chemical industry, pharmacy. France has a big financial sector. So France is, as Germany, also very much embedded into the global value chain, into supply chain, probably a little bit, if you compare to a lesser degree than Germany, but overall is also part of a globalized world. But still, most French respondents say, no, this has no advantages. 45% of French respondents say, no, globalization brought disadvantages to our country. That's also quite an amazing outcome of our amazing result of our survey. Italians are in between. I mean, Italians are fluctuating. Italians, well, 2020 was probably overshadowed by the situation with the pandemic, what was extremely harsh for the Italian society. So then there was probably also some kind of reaction for globalization. The very next year in 2021, this was already more positive. And now it's, you can see it's almost zero. That means that the supporters of globalization equals the respondents that criticize globalization. So that it's more like a neutral stance, or it's not very positive. But again, also Italy, I mean, Italy have more problems probably as France, at least if you look at the South and North divide, but still Italy is also part of the global economy and is also benefiting a lot. There's a lot of multinationals, huge Italian companies, not to mention the fashion industry. This is also part of the global economy that benefited a lot. So it's also quite concerning to see that also in Italy, as the rejection or the attitudes towards globalization are rather negative. And this has then also some repercussions, reflections, if you look at how people would like to see how the globalization should develop further. When we go to the next slide, you can see here we ask directly, because now it's all about this concept of friendshoring, that we should only do trade with partners that share our values, that have the same attitudes toward democracy and whatsoever. And we ask directly, and we ask, so should we do more trade with, or only trade with members of the European Union plus the traditional, so to speak, friends, Western world, US, UK, or should we also include Asian and African countries, our neighbor countries? And surprisingly, most people thought that, well, trade in the future should really only concentrate our closer circle of Western democracies. This kind of friendshoring, this is still debated among economists and especially debated among companies. This seems to be already embraced by most respondents. For most people, seems to be clear the next phase or the next step or the next stop for globalization is a much smaller world, a world where we only cooperate and interact with close value, like-minded partners. And even more surprising, at least for me, was the result. I mean, we included also one question and said, well, what do you think about autarky, independency, that we should probably see where all relations and try to be as independent, self-supporting as possible. And in all the countries, there was quite a high share, more than 20%, Germany a little bit less, but in France and Italy, more than 20%, more than a fifth of the respondents said, yeah, that should be the way to go forward, that we really should become as independent as possible. That means that we produce our things ourselves. It's not only fruit and energy, but also in all stuff, all goods should be produced on our soil. And that's quite something. I mean, we're living in the 21st century. We have seen this tremendous success of globalization. I mean, it was not only for Europe, but it was also for the rest of the world. We have seen it was the process or the driving force behind the fall in poverty and the increase in the global middle class. All this was made possible by this hyper-globalization, by these developments we have seen after the fall of the wall in the 90s and the beginning of the century. But still, there's a sizable chunk of the population that think it would be much better if we cut all these relations and do it by ourselves. So it's quite something like, I don't know, I mean, it speaks probably for a nostalgia or to the desire to return to the good old times. But these good old times, I mean, then you have to go probably back to the 19th or even 18th century, because even the late 19th century was a phase of tremendous globalization. And most of the 20th century was also characterized by growing trade and general growing relationships between countries. So it's a little bit concerning, to put it mildly, to see that so much people really think this is a wrong development and we should turn the clock back to to more ancient times. Last but not least, I would just like to talk a little bit about the green transformation. Next slide, the other big trend. And here you can see this is also something that is a little bit worrying. That if you ask what should be done about the green transformation, how should we make sure that we really can achieve our targets. This is a net zero target or the 1.5 degree target as formulated by the Paris Agreement. And then most people say, or most respondents say, well, it's always 50% in all countries. The best would be research and funding for new technologies. That means that there's still things that would be possible if you just have clever ideas, if you just have innovation, then it might be possible to change and to transition in a harmless, in a smooth way to a net zero world. I mean, we know the truth is different. We have seen the COP27. We have seen all the discussion taking place in Egypt and all the new reports that really claim, no, maybe it's already too late. It's very, very challenging to achieve this 1.5 or to at least to keep the temperature below the 2-degree target threshold. And we need much more radical measures. We have to act right now, and we have to increase investments and everything, not by a factor of, say, 3, 4, 5. It's not that we can just continue with business as usual. So, but this message still seems not to be taken by most of the respondents, because most think that, well, say, for example, behavioral change, which is indispensable if we really would like to achieve a net zero world. I mean, we have to change starting with travel patterns, mobility, diets. Without that, it would be probably impossible to limit the increase in temperature to the necessary degree. But also, if we ask directly about CO carbon prices, most people think, yeah, well, 10% of the or 15% in the case of France, and a little bit higher in Germany, think this would be a good measure to introduce carbon prices. All economists, I mean, all people think this is the only measure that can really help, because we have to harness the price signals, we have to harness the market mechanism to make sure that we use less and less fossil fuels. And the only way to do that is really to increase prices, because that could curb demand. And that's what happened right now with the energy crisis. So it should be taken as a blessing in disguise. But in effect, we do the opposite side. We try to limit the price increases. We have all these price caps, we have all the subsidies, and this will result in delaying the transition to a non-fossil world, to the renewables, because in the end, the market mechanism, demand and supply, is really driven by prices, and this is a very powerful, probably the only instrument where we can or what we have to achieve this transition in a market conform way. And we have already some examples for that. For example, if you look at what happens this year in Spain and in Portugal, these two countries were the first to introduce some caps on gas prices, because they're a little bit detached from the overall energy system of the European Union. And what happens? They have lower gas prices, fine, households and corporates benefited from it. But in the end, we have seen so far the consumption of gas has increased amid the crisis, amid skyrocketing prices because of the cap, and then makes it relatively more attractive to use gas. Gas consumption in Spain and Portugal has increased so far. This is for sure, this is not a well, it's probably good for the households at the moment, but overall, if you look at or if you think about the green transformation, and if you think about the necessity to get rid of fossil fuels, this is moving in the wrong direction. And the same can be said about all the looming measures that will be introduced in Germany right now and already have been introduced in France. The price caps, these are huge subsidies for fossil fuel use, and this is going really into the wrong direction. We have to think about getting rid of fossil fuels, and we have to make sure that the price, that the social costs are internalized, and this can be done with CO prices, be it taxes, be it trading system as we have in Europe, at least for part of the emissions. And it's really a big step forward we have to do, because most calculations assume, I mean, it's difficult to really calculate or to pinpoint or to have a point estimates for the social costs of carbon emissions, but the range is quite wide, but the range starts by 150 and goes up to 500 euros per ton of carbon emissions. So that means we are now, if you look at the global situation, probably at an average carbon price of 10 or something like that. So it's still way too low. It's way too cheap to use carbon, and this will hurt the environment for sure, but this will also then hurt the climate, and this will make it impossible to reach our targets of to combat or to mitigate the climate crisis. But as you can see here, these measures that would be imply that people have to also to take some harsh decisions, that they have to sacrifice their well-being. These are not very popular. These are not seen as the most important or the most successful, effective steps. Most people think that should be doable with innovation, with research, some kind of new technologies, hydrogen, or some new nuclear power 2.0, I don't know, whatever is on the mind of these people, that we are able to come out of the situation without sacrificing our well-being, without sacrificing our prosperity. But frankly speaking, this is an illusion, and to achieve or to mitigate the climate crisis, more harsh and more strict measures are necessary. Next slide, please, where we have did a little bit deeper and ask directly about this carbon tax or carbon price. And this was also very revealing, because you can see most people outrightly reject the idea, the concept of a carbon price. Because, I mean, if you say carbon price, nice, but how much should the price increase? And then you answer by 0. That means clearly that you don't think that the carbon price would be the right thing to do. And in most countries, this answer 0 is the most likely answer to be given. Then others say up to 10%. But as I said, I mean, the social cost might be much higher, clearly above 100 per ton. So a 10% increase will not do the trick. A 10% increase is much too low. We have to make sure that carbon fossil fuels are rising by a faster clip, and that means that we need a carbon tax or carbon prices administered by trading schemes that really bite, that really go to 10 or even higher price increases, so that people start to limit their use of fossil fuels, to curb their fossil fuels. And it goes without saying, this is not only an issue that we have to address here in Europe, because it's nice to have a carbon price in Europe, but we have the ETS, this trading system, and we are going to expand this trading system in the near future. But is really needed is this kind of a global carbon price to make sure that there's no leakage and no scheming to arbitrage away from high carbon prices. But this is also something that is still pie in the sky, and we have a lot of discussions about that, and we have the idea of the climate club, that would basically climate clubs, it's a center, it's the heart of the climate club, would be a common price for carbon emissions, but this still is a long way to achieve. So, but as I said before, even in Europe, where you would say these are the most, or arguably probably the most advanced, the most concerned about the climate crisis. I mean, other surveys ask, what do you think about the climate crisis? Are you concerned about it? And most people, 80%, say, yeah, well, this is one of our biggest challenges of our life. But still, if you then ask or dig a little bit deeper and ask for concrete measures, most people stop by being concerned, but not ready and not willing to take the necessary steps to really combat and to really tackle the climate crisis. That brings me then to our very last slide. Next slide, please. And this is where we then ask directly about how the willingness to pay for climate-friendly products, because we also know, I mean, in the future, if you jump into 2050, for sure, if we have then achieved, hopefully, the green transformation, then things will be not more expensive climate-friendly products because fossil fuels are maybe banned or way too expensive. We have renewables, and then we will have probably the same level of prosperity, the same level of prices as we see today. But the point is the transition. And the transition phase is difficult because we know to reach this end game, to reach this situation of net zero in 2050, we have to spend a lot of capital. We have to spend a lot of money to invest in the necessary infrastructure, renewable electrification, hydrogen, or even new technologies like I mentioned, nuclear power plants. So that will cost a lot. And this is the point that in the transition phase, as we still have not really internalized all the social costs of fossil fuels, of carbon emissions, then it's for sure much cheaper to have products that are produced in a harmful, for the environment, harmful way, because they do not have to take into account all the social and related costs, than to produce in an environment-friendly way, where you take this all painfully, stickfully at heart, and then for sure you have much higher costs. And that means that right now, climate-friendly products are still more expensive because of this unlevel playing field, because fossil fuels are not really well accounted for in the production process of, so to say, normal products, climate unfriendly products. So that means to pave the way, we have to take a step. We have to take the initiative and to pay higher prices, because as we have learned with the renewables, with wind and solar, the trick is to scale, to have this mass production, because we can see it right now also with electric vehicles. At the beginning, it was quite expensive, and Tesla was seen as a luxury car. No longer, because if you produce more and more, the prices for batteries come down. You have mass production, you know better, you have better materials, and you can bring the average cost rapidly down. Right now, for example, renewables, be it wind or solar, are less, even cheaper in production, one unit of electricity, than the classical use of oil or gas. And this was even before these skyrocketing prices we have seen after the invasion of Ukraine. So the trick is we have to start this positive cycle of scaling up, of mass production, but this has to be started. And to get started, as with renewables, we have to make front-up investments, and that will be costly. So that's the reason why we ask people, are you ready for this? Are you ready to be, to take the spearheading into this kind of climate-friendly products? And well, many people said yes, but only up to a degree. Up to 10%, this is not much. They say, well, I would be ready, but it's only a small minority of people that say, I will willing to really pay more, to really pay 10 or 20% more for climate-friendly products than for other products, for climate-unfriendly products. And here we structured the surveys or the results and the answers by age. And this was also surprising to see that the boomers, they always criticized for being responsible for all the mess, are not less willing than the younger generation. So this is quite a similar pattern we can see. And that means it's not only a generational divide, but it's widespread in the whole population. It's in the whole sample of our respondents. Yeah, to sum up, to come to the conclusion, what have we learned? I mean, it's probably a very bleak, or a very, not depressing, but a very concerning presentation, because what we have seen, that there's a lot of challenges. We know this. We are living in difficult times. We have a recession ahead of us, and probably most people are realizing it, but still the willingness or the readiness to take the necessary steps to really embrace European unity. And we can discuss it, but my personal conviction that Europe can only act together and will only stay relevant in the global economy, and if Europe act together. But there's still this undercurrent of rejection of the European project. We can see in this globalization. I'm also very much convinced that the only way forward to solve these challenges, and first, for sure, most importantly, the climate crisis, can only be achieved if we act together, if we have a revival renaissance of multilateralism. I mean, hopefully the G20 right now in Bali might be hopefully a first step that not to end the rivalry between China and the US, but at least to make sure that in some topics, and climate will be probably the most important of that, cooperation is still possible, because otherwise we will fail as global society to tackle the climate crisis. And also there's a willingness to take some own sacrifices to reduce consumption, or to pay more for climate-friendly products is not as widespread and is not as common as you would assume or as you would like to see it. So in a nutshell, it's a very, very challenging environment for politicians. It's very challenging to organize majorities to take the next step, or to take the necessary steps, so that we as a society can confront and can solve, but at least can mitigate all the challenges we right now face. So that's from my side. And now I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Arne, thank you very much for the extremely interesting insights into the minds and opinions of people particularly in France. And the title of the presentation, Pessimism Divided by the Euro, was chosen. Unfortunately, divided by the Euro, so there were some others that you have mentioned. Question number one, which is actually the right-wing parties in Italy and France have become much more powerful in recent elections. So, as you have been doing this survey for quite some time now, what is the influence? So, do you see the views, or people's views and opinions that might be have their roots in the change of the political landscape?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I mean, it's always the question is the chicken or the egg. I mean, you can see that if you have a stronger political divide, if you have this emergence of not extreme, but more not mainstream parties that also can have an influence how people think. They get confirmation of their views. They get some ambassadors, so to speak, for criticizing the European. It's no longer, so to say, forbidden or political incorrect to be against the euro, to be against the European Union. So people get more outspoken, get more confidence to stay behind their views. But I would also always argue this is something these politicians, I mean, what do politicians say? They strive, or they take this overall feelings, emotions, and try to crystallize them, to find a formula for them, to find some kind of acceptable political speech for them. And I think that's the overall attitudes, that's the skeptical attitudes, or the rather rejective attitudes towards the Euro projects. This was already the place in many, especially in Italy and France. And you can also see, I will not only talk about Italy and France, you can also see that in Germany, it's probably the numbers a little bit different, but there's also a sizable minority that are rather skeptical and rejective to this whole endeavor. And for me, this is coming to the force of more extreme parties. What we have seen now in Italy and France is more of the it's the evidence of this phenomenon, is bringing this phenomenon to light, but the views were already there. The views have been already within the population, but there was probably suppressed by the political correctness, by the mainstream parties. And now we have the situation that they came to the fore, that they articulated in the political process. And frankly speaking, I mean, we have now this new government in Italy, for example. I think that if these views now become part of the political mainstream and part of the debate. I think overall this is a development which we should also welcome, because it's much easier to discuss or to have this exchange of arguments about the advantages and disadvantages and what's happening in Europe in an open forum on the public. Then it's always talked at in Germany we call it so Stammtisch. If you always talk, it's only among friends and after the second or third beer. So this might be kind of a clearance of views, so that it's probably more informed debate, more informed discussion. This might lead to even better outcomes, because we also, this is not this year, last year, after the 2021, we asked, for example, of the new generation EU. You know, this was this huge program, literally hundreds of billions of euro spent for the recovery after the pandemic. So that was a lot of investments sparked or supported by European money. And for the first time, it was not only loans. Normally in the euro crisis, in the case of Greece or before that, we had always European loans, but with strict conditionality. There was a lot of strings attached, and that was seen then as quite not really helpful for these countries, because they lost part of their sovereignty and had to follow the advice of the Troika, then of the European Commission. Now, with the next generation European Union, we have for the first time grants. So that means they are not supposed to pay back, and the conditionality is rather weak. There are some strings attached, but generally saying, please spend the money on future projects for digitalization, for the green transformation. So basically, you can subsume everything under these umbrellas. And then we ask this question in the survey, and only 20% of Italian and French respondents were aware of these programs. They simply did not know that this kind of things exist, because nobody told them. For sure, I mean, the Italian politicians or French politicians are more keen to say, well, this is all my efforts and it's my success that we now have invested in these projects and that you can spend more money. In fact, it was European money behind it. But this makes for me also clear, these kind of views are probably also based in a very distorted perception of reality, and this distorted perception what the EU is really doing. We always talk about these examples of overregulation, and the bananas have to be the right curve and the right form. But in fact, the European Union does a lot of things, a lot of other things, and spend a lot of money and helps a lot of these countries. And that, I think, if we have this with these more critical parties coming to the forefront, and we have more of these open discussions, might help to have a better understanding of what's really going on than to have these discussions or debates only in closed rooms and behind the doors. That's my view on it.
Yeah, very good answer. I think it's quite amazing that if you look at the numbers, Germany pays like 21 billion euros into the EU, while Italy pays 1.4. The Italians, the Germans, is like kind of contradictive. Yeah. So let's globalization, and you found out that China, India, and some others are not very popular as trade partners. But what is the reason to greater independencies in the future? Is this really realistic that this decoupling will take place?
We have seen this trip of Chancellor Scholz to China, and he was also accompanied by a lot of CEOs, and clearly decoupling, I would say, even with the US and China. This is overblown concept, because we will never see the real decoupling if you mean that there will be sever all the relations and that will be no trade. It will be a more tense relation for sure. It will be more this kind of reciprocity, that we are no longer probably naively inviting Chinese investors to invest a lot of in chips and at least a critical or a high technology company. So this will be much more tense relationship, I would say. But on the other hand, I mean, this is this huge market, this big market, and a lot of German companies, especially German companies, invested already a lot. But don't forget that, I mean, even also US companies, I mean, you always look at trade figures, and then you see that the trade is probably going downwards, and there's not much because of the tariffs introduced by Mr. Trump. There's a declining trend for trade, but we have a lot, sort of direct investments. All the big American banks, all the big asset managers are hugely investing into the Chinese market. We have all the production hubs. I mean, I learned that now Apple is going to, was a big news, to reduce dependence on the Chinese market. What was the numbers behind it? They plan in the next 5 years to have, going from now, only 5% of Apple stuff is produced outside China, 5%. And they would like to increase the number to 20 in the next 5 years. So that for sure, that's a shift. That means that we are probably Vietnam and India will benefit, and we will see more iPhones produced outside China. But still, I mean, take it the other way around. Still, it means that 80% of the stuff will be produced still in China. And this is supposedly after decoupling. So then you get an impression what decoupling really means. There will be probably a reduction. We will try to lower the dependency in China for the production. But still, I mean, this is a 1.5 billion economy. And I mean, average income can be delusive, but if you just look at the West Coast, at Hong Kong, Shanghai, there's 500 billion of wealthy people, really middle class. This is a market way too big to ignore, not only for Germany, but also for the Europeans. So we will continue to have this relationship. But as I said, for critical things, for critical technology, it will be more tense. And also it will be much harder time for the Europeans to produce in China, to get a foothold in China. Don't forget, I mean, for more now, I mean, almost for 3 years, China is more or less the closed country. Because of the zero COVID policy, no foreigners allowed to enter the countries, and many have left already because of the strict closures and quarantines and all this stuff. So, and we see also that less and less Chinese study abroad, and this is also the situation for Chinese students in the American university. It becomes more difficult. I mean, for me, the bigger question is not what happens probably in the next 5 years, because there will be only at the margin some kind of decoupling. But the last 30 years was also characterized by a lot more direct exchange. I mean, all the Chinese tourists that came to Europe, the students that studied in America, that learned the American life, they learned what it means to live in the democracy, to have this freedom of speech. This is now turning backwards, and the next generation will probably have less and less direct contacts. And I'm not sure what this will do, how this will then develop in the next generation, because the idea that we see, for example, this global village with social media connecting everyone, I mean, this is also an illusion, because Facebook and all the other social media in China are different things than in the rest of the world. So we have this kind of starting where we see there's less and less exchange, there's less and less context, direct context, and that could really lead to a situation where, not in the next 5 years, not in this decade, but say in the next generation, in 20 years, there will be much less and less contact between. This is then the situation where we can also expect more miscalculations and more mistakes taking place, because now probably I would expect that most of the Chinese leaders, but also the Americans, still have a good understanding how their counterparts tick. For the next generation, they maybe will lose these insights and will lose what's really going on. And then we again, I mean, I still remember in the 80s, there was this kind of political observers looking at the Kreml, Kremologists, that trying to make sense what's coming out of this, because it was also behind the bars, was behind the walls, was a closed shop. And in China, this is for me the most worrying thing, is also developing because of the local and domestic developments into a more isolationistic, more closed society, and this is a greater challenge we have to face, and we have to find some ways of to keep the doors open and keep the contact open, because I think this is really necessary to foster the mutual understanding and to avoid this kind of grievance or emotions against each other, which might be easily fueled if you have really no contact to your counterpart. I mean, it's always the case. I mean, if you talk about the Chinese, then you can easily have a lot of negative or even positive views. But if you talk about your Chinese friends, then it's a totally different story. You have really to be very careful to avoid the stereotypes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point from one of our members, which is the Sino-German Center member of Frankfurt Main Finance, that we have regular discussions and also speeches on this topic. So where whoever is interested, just get in contact and get invited. So we have a lot of events going on with them as well. Time is almost up, and I have one more and maybe one last question, asking for a short answer. You have been doing this survey for quite some time now, and you know what the development is. But it obviously some things have happened that have changed people's minds. What do you expect to be the dominant topic in the future? Is there something at the back of your mind, a thing that will come up that looks like a long-term development?
I think for the next few years, I expect that inflation, the cost of living crisis, will be very high on the mind of the people, because we already now only at the beginning, at the start of this crisis, we have not really seen all the energy bills. We have seen higher prices in supermarkets and restaurants, but the really increase, the really shock is still to come. I think this will be one thing, and for sure the green transformation. I think this is really the topic, because I mean, I'm not talking as an insurance company, and we see it in our claims, we see it in our books, so to speak, that there is really this increase in extreme weather events, that we have more flooding. And it's not only in Europe, it's in Australia, it's in the US, it's around the globe. And this is something that really now, I think, will sink into people's mind, and hopefully it also trigger some behavioral changes, that people are ready to take the necessary steps and to sacrifice their prosperity to make what is really required to mitigate this crisis, because this is really the one life-threatening development we really face.
Very, very good. Thank you. It will be very interesting. It would be worth having you here just like once a year, whenever the survey is actual, and to see the development. Thank you very much. And thank you also, the audience, for your questions. And I think it was a wonderful speech. It was very interesting insights. We could really go on discussing about, what happens in Germany and what happens in Europe. But now the event is close to end. The next Food for Thought will be on November 30th, presented by Sonnet Frisby, who leads the geopolitical risk research of EMEA region for Morning Consult. So I'm looking forward to your participation next time. And Arne, thank you again. Have a nice day, and everybody, see you 2 weeks time from now. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you.